idea behind this is that you have the plans already laid out for the project before you begin it. Now, that is important because, and this is where one of the benefits comes in, it helps you avoid bias. Now, it's very human to, once you see your data, to kind of want to shape it, your hypotheses to the data, right? That's called harking. But it's a very human thing to want to have a good story and to want to sort of have your story consistent with the data. But it's a problem because it can undermine the quality and the reliability of research. So again, being able to pre-register what your plans are for a study before you conduct the study and before you see your data, that helps you avoid certain biases that we can fall prey to as researchers. Another benefit is that it helps us be super clear about what's exploratory research and what's confirmatory research, right? So what's hypothesis generating as opposed to what's a hypothesis testing process. Now, both are great. Both are crucial to the research process and both have their place in research. But it's super important that we can tell which one is which because there are different agendas which drive these different kinds of processes, and it's important to separate them out. Now, when you haven't gone to the trouble of sort of planning a study before you do it, you just kind of collect some data and sort of then afterwards look at conclusions, that's exploratory research. It means you're looking through your data and you're finding some things, some patterns. And it's important to say whether it's that or whether it's a planned study which has a pre-planned hypothesis that's been set out before you conduct the study. So again, it's important to differentiate between these two processes, and pre-registration can help you do that. Now, there are some limitations, I guess I would say, about pre-registration. It's not a perfect process. One thing is that it doesn't prevent QRP and fraud, right? So harking, like I mentioned before, that's a QRP or a questionable research process. The bottom line is that if people want to be horses' asses, they can do that, right? So if you want to do the wrong thing, if you want to be a fraud, no process is going to stop you from doing that. So that's one of the problems I've heard with pre-registration, that it doesn't prevent this, but it's down to the researcher and whether or not they want to do that anyway. Another limitation is that there are no checks to make sure that you've actually adhered to the plans that you've set out, right? Now, just real quick, I'm going through very quickly the general idea of pre-registration. We'll get into the details and the practical stuff later. So if you've got questions about, what you might put into your document or where you might submit it, this is all coming up. This is just a really quick sort of introduction. So back to the limitation, no one's checking if you're doing what you say you're going to do, right? So if you say in your pre-registration document, I'm going to conduct an ANOVA, and then in the publication you run a couple of t-tests, there's no process that checks that that's actually, that you've done what you said you would do. So it is a little bit of an accountability thing. You have to be accountable to yourself and stick to your own plans because, you're not going to be checked. Registered reports, they're a little bit like the older, bigger brother of pre-registration, and they're a little bit more detailed. They take a lot more time, but you get some really big benefits from them. So let's take a quick look at the process. So firstly, you specify your plans a lot like the pre-registration, except in a little bit more detail. You submit it to a journal that has the possibility for submitting a registered report. You go through the review process just like you would a full manuscript. In this case, reviewers look at your methodology and they give you feedback on it, and you refine the methodology. And once you get to the point where the editor and the reviewers are happy with the methods, you often get what's called IPA, so in principle acceptance. And that basically means that it kind of doesn't matter what your results turn out to be. If you followed your methods and you're very transparent about any changes you made, you get a publication at the end. So there are caveats to this, there are some exceptions to these rules, but that's the idea. And in my experience, it works fairly well. I've done 2 registered reports that are both published. And although they didn't go that smoothly, I ended up with 2 decent publications at the end. But we'll get a little bit more into the details of this later on. So it really helps against biases. Like with pre-registration, having your plans laid out in advance helps you from wanting to change things once you've seen the data. Like I said, you get IPA. So in principle acceptance means that even if things don't go to plan and your results turn out totally stupid, you can still likely produce a manuscript at the end that's published. Another real benefit is that you get really good methodological feedback before you conduct the study. Now, I don't know about you, but I've had experience where I've conducted a study and the methodology has been shitty, and you end up trying to publish it and all the reviewers are like, oh, this is no good. And you think, yeah, I wish I knew this before I did the study. This is exactly what you can do here. You get the feedback on the methods, which improve them before you do the study. Huge benefit in my experience. And as a result of that, you get the improved study and improved data quality, right? So people might forget your study 5 years later, 10 years later, but if you've got good quality data, then that's what's going to stick around, right? That's what really matters. One huge benefit that I've experienced that people often don't talk about is that when you get to the point where you collect your data, most of the paper is already finished. So a lot of journals don't let you go back. Once you've got IPA, a lot of journals don't actually let you go back and change anything that was previously approved by the reviewers. That makes sense. What that means, though, is that once you collect your data, you kind of just have to write your results and your discussion, and then you're done. And it is so cool when you've been like having headaches and crying over a study for years to finally get to that point after collecting the data to just go through that process really quickly. It's really nice. A couple of limitations similarly to pre-registration. If you want to be a horse's ass, you can do that. Nothing's going to stop you. So you can still do the wrong thing using these protocols. Another thing is that it takes time. These things, because you do have to go through an extra sort of review stage, these things can take longer, registered reports. That doesn't have to be a problem, but it does mean you should plan. So again, I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but that's sort of registered report in a nutshell. So that's how it differs from pre-registration. So I want to super quickly go through one of my most recent studies. We basically looked at whether people trusted findings from pre-registration and registered reports more than findings that are published in a traditional publishing model, right, without any kind of registration at all. So we showed a fictional study. An example of that is to the right on the slide, a cute little fake study that I knocked up that I thought was really awesome. And we split people into 3 different conditions. So some people were told that the study on the right was pre-registered on the Open Science Framework. And in another condition, people were told that it was the result of a registered report where the method was pre-registered before they conducted the study. And the third condition were told nothing. Again, the assumption was just that it was the traditional publishing model used. We asked them how much they trusted the study. So that was a super simple primary question. Sorry, excuse me. And we also asked them in some qualitative questions how they felt about pre-registration and registered reports. So here are the results. Ignore the familiarity thing. That was an extra independent variable we added, but that doesn't need to be spoken about for now. You can always ask me about it later if you want to. But you can tell basically it's kind of all over the place. The error bars are enormous. We had before and after exclusions plots because we had to exclude 80% of our data, more actually. Really painful, really awful. People just did not understand the question or didn't understand the manipulation questions. I don't know. But it's a mess, as you can tell. These are the numerical results. So for anyone who's familiar with Bayes factors, these are similar. These are inclusion-based factors, which basically compare the models with pre-registration against those without them included. And basically, that's what gives you a measure of the relative strength of evidence for the pre-registration given the data. So does including pre-registration as a variable, are the data more likely to have occurred under that hypothesis that pre-registration is a factor. You can tell by the Bayes factors. They're all around sort of 1-ish, which means they're not telling us very much. I'm going to move right on. If this doesn't make sense to you, that doesn't matter. The point is the data were kind of, pretty messy. What I found more interesting were the responses to the qualitative questions we asked people. So this is what we asked, and this is what they answered. About a fifth of people said they were neutral about the initiatives. 11% of them said they were useful, they were a good initiative, but they weren't practically useful. Almost half people said they were great and really useful, which is what I expected more people would say. And 2% actually said that they were bad. Interestingly, again, a fifth of people almost said something else, and they gave us some information, qualitative information. I did a content analysis, and this is kind of what people came up with. A lot of people said that pre-registration and registered reports can hinder scientific freedom. I don't totally agree with this, but I do see that it's a concern. You have some freedom less, but again, if you're very transparent about what you're doing, and if you're very clear about what's confirmatory and what's exploratory, there isn't actually a problem. But people often don't know this. And a bunch of people said that using, say, registered reports is just too slow. And that is, again, an argument that I'm susceptible to. It can take time, but that's why you've got a plan around it. A lot of people were saying that they didn't think that the initiatives were good because they're not a panacea. So they don't fix all the evils in the world. They don't fix QRP and fraud like we've already discussed, and they don't fix the file draw problem. Although they don't fix the file draw problem, everyone can just put away a messy study that didn't show any results. That's true. If you get IPA and your results end up really messy and stupid like mine did, you've got the incentive to write the publication up anyway because you get a pub out of it and you can show some interesting results anyway. So although it doesn't fix the file draw problem, it really helps towards improving that problem. And finally, a lot of people were cautious about these initiatives because they say they're not a replacement for critical thinking, and I agree with that. It's good to keep in the back of your mind that skepticism and critical thinking are always good scientific attitudes to have, and that you should never do anything in an automated process anyway. So I do agree with that one. So that's what some people said. So to sort of end this sort of theoretical area, pre-registration and registered reports are great initiatives. They do help us produce better science that's more transparent, but they do have limitations, they have caveats, and they don't protect science from bad apples. That's certainly true. There's a bad apple in every bunch, and this goes for the authors that want to do the wrong thing, but also for editors and reviewers. I think everyone who's published has an experience where they had a shitty editor or a shitty reviewer or all of the above. There is a bad apple in every bunch. Does that mean we shouldn't use these initiatives or these protocols because of that? No. And as I said before, it doesn't replace solid scientific practice and critical thinking. Keep using your brain. Keep being critical about studies, even if they are pre-registered or are registered reports. We've always got to be critical. So let's talk a little bit about the practical aspects of pre-registration and registered reports. So where can we do that? Let's start there. For pre-registrations, OSF is a great platform, the Open Science Framework, and I'll show you a little bit of that in a moment. As predicted.org is another really good outlet I've used before. I'll show you that in a moment. Another option is to do a pre-registration poster. There's actually a cute paper out on this now. I've been doing pre-registration posters now for 5 years, and they're actually really useful because you get feedback on your methods before you do the study. It's a little bit like a cute poster version of registered reports. So that's another option. Registered reports are accepted in more than 200 journals. So it doesn't really matter what field you're in. There will be a reputable journal near you that accepts registered reports. I have personal experience with the Royal Society of Open Science, Collabora, and the Journal of Experimental Psychology General. And I know personally people who've had good experiences with Psych Science and PLOS One as well. They're just a handful of good open journals, but there's heaps and heaps out there, and that number is growing literally by the day. There are so many outlets now that accept RRs. So that's really cool. So how do we do it? Let's look at the Open Science Framework first. So this is my OSF dashboard that you can see on the screen now, and up on the top right, you see Create New Project. Now, I'm assuming that if you are going to use OSF, you have an account, which is necessary. So you need to do that before doing this. Now, I'm not expecting people will follow along with this. There will be opportunities for that coming up, I believe, with regular workshops, but for now, I'll just show you a quick run through. So hit Create New Project, and you'll come up with this little dialog box. Your storage location matters for privacy and data protection reasons, so keep an eye on, because it defaults to the US, so you need to move that, say, to the Frankfurt server if you're in Europe. Once you've named it and you've chosen which repository, click on Registrations. So this page you're seeing now is the Prerego project homepage. So then once you go into registrations, you can create a new registration. What it means by registration in this case is pre-registration. So don't be worried about the terminology there. So there are heaps of options here. There are like more than half a dozen options here. These represent different levels of flexibility in terms of what you've already done, how much information is there, whether it's a replication. There are loads of different options here, and you can click on each of these little eyes and it will give you information. I'm not going to go into that now just for time reasons, but you've got options is the point. So I've just clicked on the OSF pre-registration, the most basic form, which I've used before personally, and hit Create Draft. So here we can come into the place where you put all your metadata. I've not done anything other than just the title just for this demonstration, but you're encouraged to put in as much information as you can. And you can see on the left side pane, there are all different pages where you can put in heaps of information. And of course, how much information you can put in here depends on how far along you are with your project. And not all information is required to be put in, but a lot of it is. So for instance, one thing that's not required to be put in, which would be nice, is the variables you use or you're planning to use in the study. Now, I think this is really cool because this gives you an example of what you might write. Okay, so it guides you through the process pretty nicely. Once you've filled in all of these things, which again I have not, you come to a review, which just lets you look at the information in there, and you hit on register, which is in the top right here. Click on that, and you've got a registration. It's important that you make your project public because this is the whole idea about having these pre-registrations public so people can see what you plan to do. You don't have to make it public, but I recommend doing so because that's just an extra incentive to stick to what you say you're going to do. But again, you don't have to. So that's pre-registration via the OSF, which again, the OSF is my drug of choice, but that is only because I've been using OSF since 2013, so a while. It used to be really ugly. It's heaps better now. And it's cool because you can put all your data in there. You can put your code in there. Basically everything to do with the study you can plop in there, and it's got protection, it's persistent. So, I recommend OSF, but this is aspredicted.org. It's a little simpler and it's just for pre-registrations. So how does it work? You basically just fill in a couple of questions, a bit like the OSF example, and it makes a pre-registration document for you, which is cool. So hit create, and you can put in your information, and you have your authors in here too. And there's a cute little option here. If you're not sure about what you want to do and you just want to play around with it and not create a real pre-registration, you can just hit I'm just trying things out, and that will cause the record to delete after a couple of days. So that's cool if you want to just play around and see before you commit to actually using this. The little red box at the top with that blog post of how to answer the questions, I thought that was awesome when I got started. It's been there for a while now. The blog post is great, and for those of you who want a little bit more information again about what to include, how much detail to add, it's a super good resource. So as you can see down here, I've entered a couple of options into these boxes. And again, this is a lot like the pre-registration in OSF. You have to have these basic things like analyses. It's important to specify what you plan to do with your analyses. It's important to say things about your sample size, for instance, and what you're going to do with your outliers and exclusions, how you're going to handle them. So you can see here that nothing is required. You don't have to put anything in these boxes, but the more information you put in, the better, in my opinion. It's good to have as much information in here as you can. Once you've done that, hit preview, and you're good to go. The astute of you might have noticed that I actually clicked that data collection has started. It's a fake project, so it has not, but I wanted to show you this. As predicted, pre-registrations only can be used for studies where data collection has not yet started. So it's a little less flexible than OSF, but that doesn't have to be a big problem, right? So if you already have everything and you haven't started, no problem at all. Now, if you answered no, the data collection hasn't started, you get a preview here, and you can have this as your pre-registration document, which is really nice. It just generates this neatly for you, and it's very nice. So that's all for the examples of as predicted and OSF. They're the main sort of possibilities these days. But one thing I've done in the past as well is just made a pre-registration document myself based on what I wanted to do and what I knew about. So I've got that on my OSF page, which I'll link to later. But this is a way to sort of guide yourself through the process if you're new to it. As predicted and OSF both have these good options, which I have personal experience with, so I can say about them. I liked both of them, so I recommend them. The OSF, on this link shared down here in the yellow highlight, has a bunch of really good resources. They have blog posts, they have slides, they have videos, they have these articles, they have information, they have everything about pre-registration that you would ever want to know. These three are papers that I have personally in the past found useful. There are loads of resources that will help you. So that's the link down there below, which you might want to click on later on if you look at my slides. So registered reports with Royal Society Open Science. I'm giving this as an example because I wanted to show you something, but keep in mind, a caveat to this is that every journal has slightly different requirements for registered reports. I'll just show you with Royal Society Open Science because I have the most recent experience with this journal. I don't remember with the other journals. So I'll just show you real quick what is involved. So this is just the journal's author information for registered reports. It's relatively detailed. Stage 1 registered report is when you have just started. So this is basically like your pre-registration document on steroids. And this is what you submit to Royal Society Open Science, stage 1. So it gives you all the things that you need to include. So introduction, basically the standard introduction that anyone with a science degree has learnt to do. The method section, it gives you stuff, information about what stuff you need to include, and it gives you information about the general process and what to do if things kind of go pear-shaped, which let me tell you, they do. Stage 2, it also has information about that. Stage 2 is at the point at which you have got your IPA and you're resubmitting your final manuscript. And this gives you information about what has to be done for that and what not to do. There's also some information there. Now, the OSF has also, actually, I'm not going to load that because of the internet. The OSF has an excellent page about registered reports as well. So I've got that in a link at the end of my slides too, if you want to click on that script. So a couple of tips I have. When it comes especially to registered reports, you need to plan and plan and plan some more. Stuff happens involving data collection, involving ethics, involving everything that you haven't planned for, that you don't think might happen, and it can delay the process. My first registered report, which I published back in 2016, that took 2 years, which is not very long given the fact that it was 2 replication studies, one done online and one done in person, given that it was a registered report. But these can take a long time. A friend of mine who is doing her PhD in Tilburg, she has had a registered report on her desk for 3 years of her PhD now, which is pretty long when your PhD only goes for 4 years. So please, if you are going to conduct registered reports in your PhD, plan them in to your time budget and make sure that you have studies ready to go as soon as you can. That has to be a priority. Get those documents sent out to planned papers as soon as you can so that you get a head start on everything, because it can take time. Another tip I have, and again, this is with registered reports, communicate with your editor if you have problems. Now, I had a lot of delays with my most recent registered report with Royal Society. That was partly because I had a baby halfway through, which I don't recommend for productivity reasons. But I had to, on so many different occasions, communicate with the editor. We had problems with our sample. We could not collect enough data to satisfy our sampling plan. So we had to collect more, but I had to check with the editor first because I didn't want to lose my IPA because of those problems. So I communicated with Chris Chambers about that. Chris heard from me as well when I had my baby, when I couldn't get in my stage 2 registered report manuscript. There were lots of problems. Communicate with your editor and talk to them if you're having issues, because most editors are really motivated to help you. A third thing is always be transparent with your editor, with the reviewers. Anytime you submit anything, be completely transparent about what has gone on if you have experienced problems. Like I said, with my most recent pub, we had so many problems with exclusions and with not collecting enough data and with timing. It was a mess. But we were really transparent about what happened, and that has benefited us greatly. It's also benefited other people because they've seen an inside look of what's going on and how the journal has handled it and how we've handled it. So that can be useful for others too. Always be transparent. So the Centre for Open Science manages the Open Science Framework, and so they have published on OSF these 2 lovely pages, again, packed full of resources for both RR and pre-registration. And I've found them useful more times than I can count. The Royal Society page for registered reports that gives you information about what information to include. I've got that in the 3rd resource. As predicted, you can go straight there and chuck in your information if you need to, like I showed you. I have my own couple of pre-registration documents on my Open Science Framework, which I'll go to in a moment just to really quickly show you. And lastly, I have a blog post that I did on Wagenmaker's blog, Bayesian Spectacles, where I chat about the registered report experience and how it went wrong and how we handled it. So that's been information for some people who want to see what happens when things go wrong and how you can work through them. Because I don't know about you, but my experience is that things often don't go to plan. So just really quickly before I'm done, this is my pre-registration document for my first, in the set of replication studies for my first publication. So I have a pretty detailed introduction here, which went through all the reasoning. Now, this was a replication, like I said, and there was some interesting motivation as to why we did the replication. So that's all been detailed in the introduction. So that's more detailed than you probably need to be, but this gives you an example of what you might want to do. I've got my methods with my sampling plan, pretty detailed, plans for participants, the stimulus, the 2 stimuli themselves, all sorts of information here. So this, I've got the link to this in the slides if you are interested in taking a look at this to see an example from me, but there are heaps of examples online as well. So you're not short of resources on that front. But that's just my example. I've got another one on there too for a different study or something. But take a look at my Open Science Framework page if you need anything, because it's all open and available. Lastly, I just want to quickly plug the fact that Open Science Community Groningen and Reproducibility are organising, from what I understand, some pre-registration workshops that'll come up. I have word that they are probably beginning fairly soon, within the next couple of months. So if you're interested, because this is only like less than an hour, super quick little workshop that might not help you all that much. If you want some more hands-on stuff, these workshops are going to help you. Yeah, so it depends. A lot of people refrained from commenting, and I think maybe they might have been people that were, I don't know, maybe a bit salty about the whole thing. But I think people on the whole seem to think that it was a matter of, to use Lisa Feldman Barrett's words, putting science in chains. People seem to think that the fact that it can limit you a little bit with how free you are to just do exploratory studies, people see that as being actively bad for science. Now, again, I think these are people who are less informed about what the possibilities are, right? On my Open Science Framework, I have, for the same project, I have 2 pre-registrations, and that's because after we'd done one study, we wanted to do more. So, you have flexibility, but people often don't realize that. So people mostly were seeing it from that angle and thinking that the lack of flexibility is bad for science. Yep, absolutely. If you have any idea about anything that you want to do, write it down. When it comes to pre-registration, you can be as detailed or as abstract as you want to be. And I think it's just important that that if you have any idea, that you write it down. So you might start off before your PhD, you might have some ideas, some just really just ideas. I think I want to do this. I don't know how, but I want to do it. Still write it down, because you can always add onto a pre-registration document. You can add a new pre-registration document. You can always add as you go, right? So you never have to worry about, if I write it down now, am I going to be stuck doing that? It's not like that. It's about doing science in good faith and attempting in advance to plan things out before you do them. That's all it is, right? Now, as for pre-registering your study for your master thesis, my master thesis was actually the pilot for a registered report. So the study that I talked about of mine, I piloted that. That was my master thesis. So I pre-registered it, and then I included the pilot data as a motivation for the registered report. So that's a way that you can kind of incorporate it without worrying too much about the time component. I think I got the IPA for my registered report just after I finished my master thesis or something. So that's how I integrated it. But
nice.
Yeah, nice. But pre-registration, absolutely yes. Because again, it doesn't matter how abstract it is. If you have something, you should write it down.
Also, if it's more of a exploratory kind of research, because sometimes people feel that if it's less exploratory, why would I pre-register it? Do you think it's still useful if it's more exploratory?
Definitely. I think the most important thing is to say when it's exploratory, right? So a lot of the time people are freaking out because they think, oh, I can't use exploratory stuff, but it's not that. The problem comes when people are doing exploratory research, but they imply that it's confirmatory, or they treat it as though it's confirmatory. So most of the time it's totally fine. It just means that your pre-registration will be a little bit more malleable and a little bit less concrete. But that doesn't have to be a problem, because you can list, for instance, you can have just a list. We think this might be going on. This is some literature that gives us this idea, but we're not sure. You can just be really clear. Just write it. Just be transparent and write it all down. The answer is yes. What I mean by that is that it's all of the above. There are a lot of variables that are involved with the registered report process. One thing is the journal. Different journals have different policies on how they conduct the process. So although the journals say they take a registered report as an accepted format for submission, there's no standardization as to how to do it. Now, each journal will have their policy online, so you can get a bit of sense of how they conduct them. But so my first study, which was a registered report, that one was published in 2016, before registered reports were a big thing. And that took its time because the journal was not very good when it came to sticking to what they had said in the stage one. So there was a lot of back and forth. We had to really argue for why we'd made certain choices, and the process was not that smooth in a lot of ways. But another thing that you have to take into account is, and Esther mentions this in the question, the peer review takes longer because it does happen twice. So if you have problems with the peer review process in any way, that can be magnified or doubled, because it happens twice, and you do have this back and forth. And it depends on how long the journal asks the reviewers to take when it comes to doing the reviews, right? In my experience with Royal Society Open Science, they got their reviews back to us within 3 months. Although journals often have this as a standard on paper, it often doesn't happen. So sometimes that can be the bottleneck too, that reviewers just take forever to get in touch. Or the reviewer that said they would review for the second round, they end up being AWOL and they have to find someone else to replace them, and then they have their own set of different ideas that you have to argue about. The process isn't perfect, and that all kind of comes into the fact that we're working with humans and that we are humans. Also, I had a baby. Like I said, I don't recommend that at all because it takes a lot of time and it can make the process drag on. But peer review takes longer because it's twice the amount. You often have reviewers that are going to be more anal about stuff in the stage one because they want the methodology to be perfect. That's a good thing, but it takes time. Editors, there are different policies on how long things should take. This is a case where it depends a lot on the journal. So, for instance, journals who, say developmental journals that are more used to handling longitudinal data, for instance, they're going to have policies that are much more flexible that allow for that kind of stuff. So I've seen a couple of policies where they explicitly mention the fact that this is a thing and this is how we handle it and whatnot. So I would recommend that when it comes to going to the best journal for that, go to a journal in your field or a journal that's sort of sensitive to these issues. I think that in general, the stance is fairly flexible. So journals, in my experience and in my knowledge, I've spoken to a lot of editors about these kinds of things, and the stances tend to be flexible as a default. So journals who accept the registered report format are in essence wanting to sort of facilitate the slow science process as much as possible. And that means accepting that data take a while to come through. The main thing is the transparency, communicating really clearly with editors about what's going to happen, and checking in advance if there is in the policy no mention of longitudinal studies, for instance, checking in advance with an editor or an editor-in-chief as to what's possible, and making sure that your data are the right fit for the journal. And of course, this is a matter of any submission. Of course, you want to make sure that your study and your data and your process sort of fit with the journal. So I'd always suggest to sort of ask first, unless it's in a journal, again, a developmental journal where that's kind of the norm, is to have longer running studies. So for me personally, there were two things to worry about. One thing was deviations. Again, we had issues with data, we had issues with getting stuff approved, we had issues with exclusions, and we had to deviate from what we had originally planned on a couple of different aspects. And so one of the conditions of in principle acceptance is that you stick to what you had planned, what you had put in your registered report proposal. If you don't, you are at risk of losing the IPA, but that's a fairly strict blanket rule, and in my experience, journals don't stick to that religiously. If you are very clear about what happened and why you deviated, usually that's enough. And again, that's why I've sort of hammered the transparency thing, because that's what it comes down to, being really, really clear about what happened and why it happened. As for the timeline, there are time-sensitive aspects to a registered report, often, and this is often in discussion with the editor and the reviewers, but usually there will be some kinds of timelines, but they're a little bit like, and again, this is just my experience, but they're a little bit like any timelines for a paper. Often you'll get, can you submit the revised manuscript within 3 months or within 6 months? You know, they kind of are along the lines of that anyway. And again, if you have problems, you can always ask for an extension. I think in total, I asked for about an extension of a year. So that's like an extreme example, but it gives you a sense of the flexibility that at least Royal Society has. Right, I guess I hadn't realized that is a thing, because I've done these myself before on the other side of the table. So to review them is like, yeah, of course. But it's funny that you mentioned that. I guess you really end up focusing on the things that matter. So what I mean, it sounds simplistic, but what I mean by that is that you really focus on the hypothesis generation process. You really focus on what their plans are for the methods. And I think that's why sometimes the stage 1 review process can take long, because, yeah, reviewers are often pretty rigorous about this, because they're basically saying, go ahead, go do your study, it's good. And that's a lot of responsibility, I think. At least I felt that myself. So in my experience, I focused very strongly on things that maybe I'd look at a little bit less carefully. I mean, look, results and methods are both important. But I think it's just a matter of having less to focus on, right? Instead of having this whole paper, if you've got half the paper, all your focus goes on just that half, right?
Yeah, so we add some clarity to it, or at least, it also takes away the tendency that you have to see what came out of it. So
exactly
on the results, you can focus on them if there aren't any. So that's
No, you're spot on, and I think that's the thing. I think we've actually personally discussed this before. Having that story, right? Having the whole story and wanting to write a nice story. When you don't have that motivation by the author, when they're just saying, "This is my plan for a study. This is what we want to do," you kind of see it with a different lens. You know, you assume. I think I would have implicitly assumed better on the part of the author. Now, what I mean by that is that I had only good intentions assumed on them. I didn't look at the results and go, I don't know about that. I don't know if you can predict that four-way interaction.
Yeah.
You don't have that. So there's only, wow, these authors are really just trying to do good, slow science. And I think maybe it gave me more patience or more understanding or gentleness. I don't know. This is, of course, post hoc. I don't know. I try and be fair as much as possible with every review I do, regardless of the kind of submission it is. Yeah. But yeah, I've been more rigorous and maybe more patient. Yeah. Yeah, so it's a little bit like if you do a review for a normal submission where they ask you, would you like, how you usually have to like tick a box or something, or say, I'm willing to review future revisions of this manuscript. Yeah. It's a little bit like that. They'll just say, are you willing to review the stage 2 manuscript for this submission? So it's very similar to that. And honestly, I've seen it a little bit as like just being a second version of a manuscript with just a huge revision. So it's a little bit like that. That's kind of what it seemed like to me. One thing I just will say, feel free to type anything into the chat if you're interested in asking a question. You can always email me too. I'm an early career researcher with a toddler, and although I don't have that much time, I always have time for people who need a little bit of guidance with this kind of stuff. So if you're unsure and you don't know who to ask, I can either point you in the right direction. I've done that a lot of times before, where I've tried to put people in touch with the right people to ask their questions if I can't answer them. But if you have questions that are appropriate for me, please feel free to email me or Twitter me. Twitter. Oh my God, I just said Twitter me. I meant DM me on Twitter. All that information's on the slide, so please get in touch with me if you have questions afterwards that you forgot to answer or just want to know. Yep.
Super thanks.
No worries. Thank you for having me. It's been fun. I love talking about this topic. It's such a thing for me. It's one of my babies.
Yeah, it's nice, and you're really enthusiastic about it. You can see it. So it's also really nice to listen and to see you talking about this topic.
Great.
Thank you so much. Also, thank you a lot to the old attendees, and hope to see you at the next OSCG workshops.
Yep.
Okay.
All right. Take care. Have a good weekend.
Bye.
Bye.